think we'll get started. Today the meeting is about one of our contemporary saints. His name is Abuna Abdel Messiha El Habashi, which means Abuna, servant of Christ, and the Habashi means the Ethiopian. So his name literally means servant. Abd means servant, and El Messiah means Christ. So that's what he named himself. Although he had a different name when he first started, but when he came up to Egypt, this is the name he chose for himself. Yes. Yeah. This one's a different one, yeah. He lived from 1898 to 1973, so he's a very contemporary saint. He wasn't very fond of getting his picture taken, so we have very, very few pictures of him taken, and every time someone tried to take a picture of him, it always turned out to be a very bad picture. He'd always frown or do something. Although in reality, he was a very delightful person and a very sweet person. There's a great book on him that I think we have in the bookstore. If you're interested in reading this book, that's the cover of it. One of the few pictures we have of him, and you can see how simple he is. It's written by Abdel Messiha, and it's in the bookstore if anyone's interested. So, Abuna Abdel Messiha is what we would categorize a fool for Christ. It's kind of a category of saints. It's sort of a class of saints, and it's a kind of different type of saint than other saints. So, in the church we have different, personalities, and that's okay, right? You have someone like Saint Athanasius, who's a theologian, who's an intellect, who's a scholar, and then you have him meeting someone like Saint Anthony, right? Who's a monk, who's an ascetic. And then there's this category called fools for Christ. And these are people who have chosen a different path, right? And basically, they follow this verse, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honorable, but we are despised. So what the holy fool does, he actually intentionally acts kind of foolish in front of people, right? And what they do is they tend to hide their holiness through this action, right? So these people become very famous. People want to see them. People want to take their blessing. And at one point, Pope Kyrillos had to step in and sort of ban people from seeing Abuna Abdel Messiha because so many people were coming to visit him. And so what he would do is he would just kind of act crazy and just not really care about what anyone says. And he'd say kind of strange things, and he'd say things off the cuff, and he wouldn't really care what people thought. So a quote here is, behavior which is caused neither by mistake nor by feeble-mindedness, but is deliberate, irritating, even provocative. And if you remember, a few months ago, we talked about Abuna Justus. Was anyone here for the talk on Abuna Justus? So Abuna Justus also fits in this category of a fool for Christ, as do some of the other saints. Saint Anna Simone, for example, is a fool for Christ. Ember Wiz is a fool for Christ. These are people who, like Ember Wiz, was just like a homeless guy. He was just literally a homeless guy and sold salt on the back of his camel. Right? And so these people lived this very, very simple life. And a lot of people had no idea that he was actually a saint. But few people did, and then sort of his notoriety would slowly get out. They feign insanity, pretend to be silly, provoke shock or outrage by deliberate unruliness. So they just do all kinds of things. I remember one time I was watching, there's a monk named Abuna Fanus in St. Paul's Monastery in Egypt. He's also one of these people who's a fool for Christ, very saintly man. I was watching a videotape of him, so someone went in and snuck a video camera into the monastery, just started videotaping him. So he was kind of praying, and then as soon as he realized he was being videotaped, it was during one of the readings. I was watching him. He kind of looks at the camera, and then he just sits there. He sits down, puts his feet up, like towards the camera, takes his socks off, and starts wiggling his toes at the camera. Just kind of like, is this what you're here to videotape? Well, then here you go. What's that? And I just started laughing, watching, because he's just kind of looking at you like, what, you here to videotape me? You think I'm, here you go. And he starts doing some crazy stuff, right? So kind of consistent with this last point where they kind of feign insanity, even feign foolishness, unruliness. What's that? To hide it all, right? And this is an important characteristic, by the way, of the Christian life, which is When we have our relationship with God is not something that we, as Orthodox Christians or as traditional Christians, really proclaim and throw out there, right? As much as we can as Christians, we hide what we have, right? We keep it hidden. Our works, even, Christ, when he says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So even our works, we want to hide from people. And during the Lent, we read about when he says, when you fast, you wash your face and anoint your head, and don't let people know that you're fasting. Don't let people know that you're praying. Don't let people know you're doing almsgiving. It's a very important part of our spiritual life that we not take our relationship with God or even special things he's given to us and throw it out to everyone and say, hey, look at me, right? It's a very personal, very close thing that we keep close in our hearts. And so this is what these saints were trying to perfect, which is they have these very deep relationships with God, and they want to keep that on the inside. And this is a very important concept in our life. Like I said, Saint Simeon the Stylites, Abuna Justus, all they're holy fools, voluntarily pretend they're insane. Sometimes they're half naked, they're homeless, they speak in riddles, occasionally being disruptive, challenging to the point of seeming immoral even. Okay, so this is their character, right? They just go out there and they do things and they say things and they don't care what anyone says or anyone thinks, right? So these are sort of, Abuna Abdel Messiha fits in this category, I think, of saints, of these holy fools for Christ, right? People who have just taken on this, I'm nothing. In fact, I was reading that book, and one of the monks was trying to mess with Abuna Abdel Messiha. So Abuna Abdel Messiha was weaving some palms, and he just started saying, Abuna Abdel Messiha, you are such a saint. You're such a good man. He is such a holy guy. He was talking to someone else. And he just ignored him, and he just weaving his palm as he's making a basket. And he just kept praising him, and because he's trying to impress some other person. And then finally he goes, you know what, Abuna Abdel Messiha, this guy's a hamar. He's a donkey, right? And he starts calling him a donkey. And then immediately Abuna Abdel Messiha starts laughing, and he goes, exactly, now you've got it right. So he pretended he wasn't hearing him the whole time. And as soon as he called him a donkey, he starts laughing. He goes, now you've got it. That's exactly what I am. I'm a donkey, all right? And then the next time he sees them, this man wanted to introduce Abuna Abdel Messiha to all of these monks who had come to see Abuna Abdel Messiha. And he says to him, this is Abuna Abdel Messiha al-Humar. This is how we introduced him. And Abuna Abdel Messiha just laughed and said, that's exactly right. And the reason this person did this was to show all of these monks the humility of this man, right? Like, I'll introduce him and call him a donkey. Something that if one of us was introduced that way, we'd be like, huh? You know who I am? Right? And he introduced this saint this way just to show all the monks how they would respond, right? So this is the level of humility that Abuna Abdel Messiha had, and it wasn't something he was faking or pretending, or this is how he felt, right? And so when someone called him that, he was like, all right, now you're on to something. Now you've sort of understood it. And the reason, by the way, these saints can do this is they're not looking at us, right? They're not looking at each other. They're only looking at Christ. That's the only person he sees, right? And so when you are only looking at Christ and your focus is on Christ, when you look at yourself, you're like, there's infinity and there's any number. And I can tell you infinity is infinitely higher than any number. That's it, right? And this is the proper attitude of Christian life, right? When you have a kid in second grade and kid gets an A on a test, right? If he starts looking around and goes, I got 100%, I beat every kid in this class, he's going to think he's all great, right? But all the kid has to do really is to compare himself to the teacher. And when he looks at the teacher, he goes, wow, I'll never get to that point, right? Or the teacher's so much higher than me. But when we compare ourselves to each other, it's easy to become arrogant and say, well, I'm better than that guy, or that person over there, or she does this, or he does that, and that guy doesn't really serve as well as I do, and blah, blah. Why? Because we're comparing a bunch of ants, and we're all these little ants talking to other ants, and we're all looking at each other. Don't look at the ants, right? So these people were saints because they focused on Christ in a way. It's a singular focus, right? That's all they saw, right? And so you can call him a donkey, and he'd be like, well, absolutely. Of course we are, right? And for you to not think that actually means you're a little bit blind to the reality of who you are and what you are, right? And so he basically is rejecting the world and all of its glory at its most fundamental level. And the most fundamental level is human dignity, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Fundamental rights of a human being. I don't need your fundamental right of dignity. You don't have to give me any dignity, right? This rejection of the world. And we'll see this in his life quite a bit. So apparently his parents were very wealthy and in Ethiopia. And he had lived on a farm and a lot of acreage and all this other stuff. And his parents were rich, and he lived in a very, very nice village, a very rich place. And he just left and went to the monastery in Ethiopia, to the point where his parents didn't know where he went. They had no idea where their rich son, heir, had gone. In fact, his dad died and still didn't know where he was. So when his dad had passed away, they had no idea if he was alive, dead, or where he had gone. And his mom, later in life, found out, after he'd left Ethiopia and gone to Egypt, she found out he was in Wadi Natrun shortly before she died. So she had the grace of actually knowing that he was still alive, but he just disappeared. And, when they asked him why you left, he would always say, wealth was overflowing, but there was no Christ there, right? Lots of money, no Christ, not interested. And that's why he left, and that's why he left his village and everything he had. So, again, and reminds us again of some other saints, right? Saint Arsenios and some others who came from Maximos and Damagios, Saint Anna Simone, who came from a very rich background, lots of money, lots of power, lots of prestige, and their rejection of it is so complete that they become fools. Like Saint Anna Simone, as you all know, was a queen, right? I mean, heir to a kingdom, right? Big time money. And she left, and because she wanted to not have anyone praise her or give her any dignity for who she was, she went and she pretended she was retarded. She couldn't talk. They'd tell her to do something. She'd kind of stutter. They say, okay, you clean the toilets in the monastery, which isn't a great job. And that's the job she did, right? So it's very consistent, right, that someone who has so much money sees what it's actually worth, which is nothing, right? So when someone who has that much is in the power to see what all that is worth, he realizes it's worth nothing, right? And he just left it, absolutely, without any hesitation. So I just wanted to give you a little clip of what his life was like in the Ethiopian monastery. I read this in that book I showed you, and it just kind of blew me away, so I thought I'd share it too. So in the Ethiopian monastery, the day starts at 11 p.m. From 11 to 5 a.m., they would do tazbih. On Sundays, they would follow the tazbih with a liturgy. And then at 8 a.m., and then you'd go back to your cell and do your own personal meditations or prayers or whatever until 8 a.m., and that's when the work started. 8 to 1 was your share of work. You had 5 hours of your particular duty. And then you would rest until 3 p.m. So after 1, you would go back to your cell, rest, sleep, presumably. And then you had your one meal a day at 3 p.m. And it was like bananas or fried bananas or something like that. And you'd rest until 3 p.m. and then there would be a few more labors before you'd go to bed for the next day. So that was their cycle. And Abuna Abdel Messiha lived there in the Ethiopian monastery for a while and then decided to come to Egypt because he wanted to be with the monks in Egypt. And this man walked from Ethiopia to Egypt, so a distance of 2,500 kilometers. And they don't know the exact path he took. They think he went up along the Nile, which would be the safest path and the most populated path. And they know that occasionally he would get a few rides from some Bedouins or some people who were traders. They would kind of see this man walking by himself. But you can imagine being in the middle of nowhere and just saying, all right, time to go to bed. And I'm just going to lay out here and go to sleep now. And he did this, and he took him several months to walk from Ethiopia to Egypt. And one of the characteristics you find in Abuna Abdel Messiha is he feared nothing. And when I say nothing, I mean absolutely nothing. The man had no fear. And this is actually a very important characteristic of spiritual life. So this is sort of the second thing I want to point out with Abuna Abdel Messiha, is his lack of fear of anybody or anything. right? And many of the fathers will tell us that fear is a symptom of a weak spiritual life, being afraid, right? And in America, we're very, the capitalism plays on this fear, right? We can buy, you can buy life insurance, you can buy homeowners insurance, you can buy disability insurance, you can buy, fire insurance, earthquake insurance. There's all kinds of insurance you can buy, and you can plan for this retirement. Then if this happens to me, then I can get this plan, and if that happens, and what's that? As if it's the comfort, right? We buy this, and then our house, we need to protect this, so we're going to buy this special deadbolt, and we're going to buy a security system, and this security system, if anyone comes in, it actually calls the police for you, and we play, the capitalism plays on our fear, right? Because we have a symptom, right? Fear is a symptom of a spiritual life that's not quite there yet, right? Whenever we see someone afraid, we have to ask, what's wrong in the spiritual life, right? It's a symptom of something worse. And Abdel Messiha typified this. He feared nothing and no one, not nature, nothing, right? He didn't care about his body. He didn't care about the future. He didn't really care about any of these things, right? And when people described him, they said, he reminded them of Elijah or John the Baptist, right? Two of these guys who just feared nobody, no man, no nothing, right? And, there's a funny story I'll tell you in a second, but I'll tell you this right now. When Pope Kyrillos was ordained, so him and Pope Kyrillos were very close as monks. In fact, after Pope Kyrillos left the windmill, his cell, Abdel Messiha went and lived in Pope Kyrillos' cell for a while. So they were very close. After Pope Kyrillos became a pope, he told everyone, don't tell Abdel Messiha that I've become pope, right? And instead, he wanted to come visit the monastery and tell him himself. Of course, as he's there, Abdel Messiha knows that he's the Pope, and he knows he's there. He goes walking right to his cell. He knocks on the door, and he's going to start yelling at Pope Kyrillos for accepting being a Pope. He was going to go let him have it, basically, right? And Pope Kyrillos knew he was doing this, knew he was coming, felt him coming, started laughing. He prayed on some water, and as soon as Abdel Messiha walked in, Abdel Messiha, he took water and he threw it in his face. And he made the sign of the cross over him and gave him a hug, right? Like don't yell at me. I had to do it. But you see that relationship, right? I'm going to walk up to the Pope, and I'm going to let him have it. Like, how could you accept this? And by the way, Pope Kyrillos and Abdel Messiha and Abuna Metta al-Miskin, the three of them, were very much against this concept of monks becoming elevated to bishop or pope. In their minds, or even a priest, in their minds, a monk is a monk. And this is actually the more traditional notion of monasticism, right? Nowadays, every time, when someone becomes a monk, it's very shortly thereafter they become a priest. And in the early church, that was not the case. You became a monk, and you were just a monk for the rest of your life. In fact, in Deir Abu Ma'ar or St. Macarius Monastery, that's still the way it is. If you want to be a monk, you go there, and they only have a few priests in the entire monastery, right? They're all just monks. So Abuna Messiha was of this same mindset, and Abuna Metta got it from him, that a monk is a monk and should not be clergy, even a priest, but let alone a bishop or a patriarch. So, but I just wanted to give you that story of like how he had no fear, right? He just would barge in, and instead of doing a matanya to the Pope, he's going to go in and just like let him have it. How could you accept this? So he did not fear people. He did not fear devils. He feared nothing, right? And again, that's an outcome of a spiritual life, a very strong spiritual life, right? He's not afraid of what you do to the body. He knows that Christ is with him. He used to say, Christ is my fuel. When people would say you're not eating enough, he said, Christ is my protection when they say you're not protected enough. He actually refused to put a door on his cell. So and his cell wasn't like in the monastery. His cell was like in the middle of nowhere. It was about a 2-hour walk from the monastery. So he's out in the middle of the desert. There's, wild animals, scorpions, all kinds of stuff out there. He refused to put a door on his cell. And he would actually put a palm tree. So he had 2 palms. He'd put one straight up and down and the other one sideways. And he'd make a cross. And of course, the whole door's open, right? It's just 2 sticks. And whenever the monks would try to talk him into putting a door, and one of these monks, by the way, was Pope Shenouda. When he was a monk, he was Abun Antonius. He was also a very good friend of Abuna Abdel Messiha. And he personally tried to build a door for Abuna Abdel Messiha many times. And he would say, no, look, I just have this cross. I put this great door, right? And again, you see that characteristic of no fear. And then when asked, he would say, does a wolf fear another wolf, right? And he would basically argue, that the person who is spiritual has a fiery spirit, right? And if I'm a wolf myself, then I should fear no wolf. And when he came to the monastery, the first cell they gave him, he refused it. So he was given a 1.5 square meter cell that was underneath a tower, underneath the stairs of the tower. And that's where he lived when he was in the monastery. He was initially assigned to the kitchen, which, believe it or not, kitchen duty in the monastery is one of the best duties. Because it just gets worse from there. And so what he would do is, he couldn't work the kerosene stove. So every time they say, go make me a cup of tea or something, they go in there, 20 minutes later, he's still staring at the kerosene stove because he couldn't work the kerosene stove. And then finally, he was removed from kitchen duty and given other things. And as he was being removed from these duties, the people who knew him knew he was laughing, and he would always laugh because he was just faking that he couldn't do anything so that he would get demoted, right? And he didn't want the good job of being in the kitchen and making tea for guests, right? That's the cushy job. So he would just continue to kind of fail at things. I mean, this guy is a wealthy man, son of wealthy parents, educated. He can work a kerosene stove, right? But he would continue to kind of fake that he didn't know how to do things until he got demoted for getting harder and harder jobs until he got the ones he actually wanted. So he did a lot of this. He had this little bit spirit of rebellion in him, right? When there's something he didn't like, he wouldn't take it. He would just kind of say, no, I'm not going to do that. And I'll share with you a story here in a bit. So there's this guy named Professor Otto, and I can't really say his last name, Meinardus. That sounds wrong. But anyway, this guy wrote a great book. I don't know if anyone's seen this book, A Story of the Copts, and it's about the history. He's actually a Protestant professor, and he just documented a lot of Coptic stuff. It's a really good book. But he talks about Abdel Messiha, and he says he's one of the greatest influences on Coptic monasticism in the 20th century. So you have to remember when Abdel Messiha walked into these monasteries were corrupt, right? In many places, including Ethiopia. And a lot of the people that were there, monks, had gone there because they wanted to become bishops. So they would go become a monk so they could eventually become a bishop, right? In fact, Abdel Messiha had such little fear for any clergy that one time 2 Ethiopian bishops came to visit him. And they walked in, he kind of opened the door, he kind of looked at what they were wearing. And he just looked at him, he said, "You devils." He turned around and he walked away. So the guy had no fear. But anyway, he really despised the corruption, right? And he despised the glory and the seeking attention that was going on. So he revived this monastic spirit in a way that the church hadn't seen, because it's very hard to find a real monk back in the day. It was like Pope Kyrillos, who's Abuna Mina Mitawahid, the solitude, and Abuna Met al-Miskin, and him. And these were like the 3 big ones, right? That really kind of showed everybody what real monasticism was like, and he was one of them. He heavily influenced actually Abuna Metta and Pope Kyrillos. And it says he was contributing to a major revival in anchorite asceticism, not simply through words, but through his acknowledged central discipline of a daily Eucharist. So his life and his devotion to the Eucharist was similar to Pope Kyrillos's. As you all know, Pope Kyrillos used to have a Eucharist every day of his life. And they estimate, tens of thousands of liturgies Pope Kyrillos prayed. And Abuna Abdel Messiha had this same devotion to the liturgy. So the liturgy, the Eucharist, became, again, this central focus of Christian life versus a ceremony, right? Or something we do on Sundays, or some, rituals that we go through, and Abuna says that, and the deacon does that, and then we go around in a circle, and then he does some thing with a censer, and then we all go home, right? To them, the Eucharist was a central part of everything, right? And he revived this. Yeah.
What about Abuna Abdel Messiha Benahri? He's also the same like Pope Kyrillos, like Abuna Abdel Messiha.
Well, there's many I didn't mention their names. I mean, there are many others, but
Have you read his life story?
no, not recent.
I was there in near Armenia, and I saw where he lived in a very small, ugly room, and
So maybe we'll cover him.
the same nature like.
So maybe we'll cover him another time. We're looking actually for different saints to talk about, so maybe we'll cover him as well. We're trying to do many of the contemporary saints, so that's a good suggestion. Okay, so and I guess this is Professor Otto's description, not mine, but he talks about these three pillars, and he talks about the intimate connection between Abuna Metta, Pope Kyrillos, and Abuna Abdel Messiha. And the three fathers lived in caves near the monastery of the Romans. He occupied, as I said earlier, Pope Kyrillos' cave after he left. And this is the story I told you at the end. When Pope Kyrillos was first elected, he came out to talk to him and yell at him, basically, for accepting this great honor. Oh, and I do want to share another story, and I don't know if I shared this story with you when we talked about Abuna Justus before, but he actually, before he died, he wanted to visit Jerusalem. He wanted to come to Jerusalem. So he decided to walk to Jerusalem, but on the way, he wanted to see Father Justus. The angels are here. The angels are filling the church, literally. So, as I was saying, so he wanted to visit Abuna Justus, and we talked about Abuna Justus last time. And I want to share with you an interesting, a beautiful story about him and Abuna Justus. He was actually outside the gates of the monastery, and all of a sudden people inside the monastery saw Abuna Justus stand up and start walking toward the gate. And he would do matanyas. Every few seconds, Abuna Justus would do a matanya, which means a prostration. And the people on the outside were saying that Abuna Abdel Messiha, as he was walking toward the gate, he would also do a matanya every few seconds. So, and the gate is, 27 feet high, right? And it's very thick. So they're not seeing each other through the gate, but each one is responding to the matanya of the other person. And they did 10 or 15 of these matanyas before they actually made it to the gate, opened the door, and gave each other a big hug. And they sat and talked for hours, but the interesting thing is Abuna Abdel Messiha barely spoke Arabic. So what they talked about, or how they talked, or that connection they felt, it's amazing, right? It's the same story as St. Anthony and St. Paul when they met out of nowhere and just talked, right? How they were drawn to each other in the spirit. A very nice story that those two met. And then he left there and went to Jerusalem. Very quickly, I'll talk about his relation to the animals. One thing I want to point out in this is I'll talk about this. In his cave, it said he had spoken of lizards, snakes, and scorpions as his friends. So Abuna Abdel Messiha also would get very upset if anyone killed a scorpion. He'd say, why? Why are you killing the scorpion? These are God's creatures. Every time a monk would just kill a scorpion, he'd say, why do you got to kill a scorpion? Right? So he would talk to them as his friends. In fact, this one story is related to us. Even a very large and dangerous snake is said to have lived with Abuna Abdel Messiha for some years. The monstrous snake would come and sit next to him or even lie down on his lap. Does anyone know another story of a saint with a snake? Who remembers from their Sunday school class? That's true, yes. Saint Barsuma Al Aryan, very good. No, how do you know? You didn't see the snakes. So, in the picture, it's a bigger snake. So it's said that he lived with this snake. And again, I want to point this out, that these are not just stories that we tell. This is theology, right? So we think about, what does this remind us of? Who can remember? Huh? Beginning of life, no fear. When was that? Before sin, right? When the story of Adam. Right, so we think about the story of Adam. Adam was created in the paradise with what? All of the wild animals. And he was given dominion over those animals, right? And God even said, you get to name the animals, right? That's what it says in the book of Genesis. So he had dominion and power over these animals. He was not afraid of these animals. And part of our spiritual life is to return to the state of Adam before the fall. So when we read a story like this, about a snake or a scorpion or a lizard, it's not just a miracle story. It's saying this person became so pure, he became like Adam before the fall, right? And that's what the church is trying to teach us. And he is reported to have lived with a wolf in 1964. The wolf in the cave used to sit with him, and he patted it on the back, allowing the tawny gray mammal, which had a formidable reputation for flesh eating, to leave the cave if visitors came. So whenever the visitors would come, he'd say, tell the wolf, why don't you just go now, because I don't think other people are going to appreciate your presence. Right? And so I want to tell you this one story, then we can go. But the head of the monastery refused to let him live a solitary life. He asked to live a solitary life like Pope Kyrillos, and the head of the monastery said no. And the reason he said no was Saint Abdel Messiha, if you remember, walked from Ethiopia. He didn't have any papers or any passport or anything. In fact, the way he got over the border was he basically took a cane and he kind of held it over his shoulder and pretended he was a shepherd and just kind of walked through the border, right? And just hoped that nobody would stop him. So he had no papers whatsoever. At the time, there was a war going on, and the head of the monastery was worried that if he was captured or something, they would ask for your papers. He'd say, I don't have any papers, and it would come back to the monastery and cause problems for the monastery. So the head of the monastery was like, you know what, you shouldn't be out there by yourself, because if something happens, we're going to get blamed. And he was kind of worried about the politics, between the government and the monastery and things like this. So Abdel Messiha asked him, can I leave? He said no. He said, can I leave? He said no. So he took some rope. He would jump up a palm tree, grab palms. Every night he'd weave a little bit of rope. And after a few months, he had enough rope, and he tied it to a door handle, threw it over the wall of the monastery, which is, again, 27 feet high, climbed over it, and escaped the monastery. And so this was he's a very rebellious guy, as you can see. The head of the monastery said, don't worry, he's going to come back in a few days for water. He has to have water. True enough, he came back after a few days, wants some food and water. The monks kind of grabbed him. They locked the door, and they wouldn't let him leave. And then they kind of humiliated him and said, now you have to promise you're not going to leave. He said, all right, I'm not going to leave. And then, of course, a week or so later, he immediately took the rope, threw it over again, and left, and went and lived in Pope Kyrillos' solitary cell. And then this time, they sent out the police to find him, and they brought him back handcuffed. The head of the monastery did this. So this was, the reason I bring this point up is Abuna said something today during the sermon. He said, suffering is a school that teaches us. Suffering is a school that teaches us. And sometimes we think that these monks and these saints, they had the good life, right? And here you're a monk, the head of your monastery sends the police to arrest you and bring you back in handcuffs and humiliate you in front of all the other monks. So forget being called a Hamar, which is what also happened to him. This kind of humiliation is tough, right? These are the trials that these monks went through. And what I like to do is point out the fact that these monks did not live, or these saints did not live these perfect luxury lives, but rather lived very difficult lives and had all kinds of temptations and trials. This is another picture of him with I'm aware. Okay. Huh? The website was kind of weird. It's like, that's what I meant. Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. That's probably why the Google search came up with the wrong one. Yep. Who did? Oh. Oh, really? Yeah. Really? Yeah. He vanished, yeah. So to finish the point, he walked to Jerusalem because he wanted to die in Jerusalem, and no one ever saw him again. So they have no idea if he ever made it. He had to get special permission because, you remember, he knew Pope Shenouda when Pope Shenouda was a monk. And then when Pope Shenouda became Pope, he had a very special fondness for him and let him stay in the, I'll tell you a story, a few stories that Abu Antonius told me. Abu Antonius Yunan had some books, actually some stories in this book. But Abu Antonius was sat with him, got to sit with him once, back in the day, the 50s or something. And he said, he told me this story, and he said, we're a bunch of college students, and we asked him, Abuna, give us a word, give us something spiritual, tell us something. So, and I kind of want to relay this to you, and I don't know how to do it as well as Abu Antonius Yunen could relay stories, but he basically said, so do you guys know the parable of the man who built his house on the rock and the man who built his house on the sand? And they said, well, of course, yeah, we're Sunday school teachers. We know that parable. He goes, oh. And I want you to, I'm just going to tell you the story, but I want you to cut the speed in a quarter of basically, he talked very, very slowly. And he basically said, well, then that's great. So then why do you need a word from me? You know that parable. And they said, well, yeah, but, okay, say something, saintly, say something cool, right? And he said, well, so when you build your house on the rock, how do you build your house on the rock? And they said, they gave the Sunday school answers from the 4th grade, right? Read the Bible, confess. He said, very good. What else? And they said, take communion. He says, oh, very good. What else? And he said, pray. And he said, very good. You guys know this. What do you need me for? And they just kind of looked at him like, we learned this in the 3rd grade, right? Sunday school class. And the point I want to make is, and the way Abu Antonius told me this story is, that's really it. You just have to do it, right? There's nothing to learn from a saint in the sense that there's no special magic, secret sauce, tell us something, tell us a word. You just have to do the things that we know to do. And that's it, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times, when teaching Sunday school or something, you tell the kids, what should you do? Oh, yeah, read the Bible. Okay. Do you read the Bible? Well, no, but yeah, I know that's what you're going to say, right? Or let's pray about it. That's one of the things, and I remember hearing a sermon once by a very saintly man. He said, let me pray about it. And the guy said, so what, you don't want to help me? That was his response. It's like, I've got a real big problem. He said, I'll pray about it. He said, oh, you want to help me? And in fact, he said, I prayed about it, and I went to Mbab Shoy, and I said, you got to solve this problem. And he said, 2 weeks later, the guy comes back and says, what'd you do? It's all solved. Who's the connection? What's the secret? And he said, I'm not going to tell you. Right? But the point I want to make is when my uncle asked him about, Abdel Messiha, about what to do, it was very simple. And it's just a matter of doing it, of living this life of confession and communion and prayer. And again, these saints have really, in their minds, have nothing to offer. I think that's the important thing. Okay. And then Buna once told me this other story where they were watching him. It was during Kiyak, and they had gone for Kiyak. And as you know, in the monasteries, Kiyak goes all night. And they said he was standing there, and they all wanted to watch what he did during Kiyak. And he would just stand there in front of the icon of St. Mary. And they said he would take one leg, and he would just kind of curl it up, further than I can go, and just stand there on one leg, and he would pray for like half an hour or an hour. And they're just watching him, He said, and all my friends are like, look, he's up on one leg. He's just standing there. And then after a while, he'd put this other leg down, and he'd bring up his other leg, and he'd pull it up, and he would stand on this one leg and just pray for hours and hours in front of this icon. So anyway, these are 2 stories that Abu Antonius relayed to me that I thought I'd relate to you. Maybe we'll do Abuna Abdel Messiha al-Manahri next. Let's put his picture up. Maybe that's a prophecy that we need to do him next. Okay.
Almost identical, maybe in terms of life.
Mm.
And he pretend to be stupid or fool, and exactly the same.
Yeah.
Like they said now.
Now I've seen his picture many times. I think when I did the search, it came up and gave me his picture next. But I didn't think it looked like him. Any other questions, comments? Yeah. No, the only one that's not is that one. I've seen this one before. But this one, these 2 definitely are. Oops, sorry. That one is it, and that one's him. Those 2 are definitely him. Any questions? All right. Glory be to God forever. Amen. Let's stand and pray. Through the intercessions of the Holy Mother of God, Saint Mary, Saint Paul, and Abdel Messiha El Habashi, hear us, Lord, and say to you with all thanksgiving, Our Father, who art in heaven,